In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of natural law. In our discussions thus far, and in our activities, we have looked at moral scenarios and focused primarily on identification, specifically identification of the three sources of morality: object, intention, and circumstances. Now we're going to move forward and not simply identify these things, but morally analyze and assess them. No longer are we going to be content simply identifying the object, but we also need to ask the question, is the object morally good, morally bad, or morally neutral? And we will do the same thing with the intention and even to some extent the circumstances. Now, in order to assess something as morally good, we have to have some rule or measure or standard by which we can judge them. Under no circumstances are we going to judge something as morally good or morally bad based upon our opinion. In fact, we have no authority to be able to assess something as good or bad based upon simply our opinion. We must have some objective standard above and beyond our own personal thoughts and feelings. What are these standards? The first and most basic is natural law. So natural law is natural not because it deals with nature as being out in a park and experiencing wildlife and trees and grass and any of these sorts of things. What we mean by natural law is a law which is derived from the nature of a thing, a particular created item. And so natural law really refers to the essence of a thing or the nature of a thing. The nature or the essence of a thing is a principle, and it is a principle of two things. First, it is a principle of being. Right? In the created order, things are made out of matter, and we might have something that is made out of a combination of wood and metal and plastic. But this wood, metal, and plastic is arranged in such a way that it is a table. Therefore, it has the nature of a table. It's that nature which gives the form to the otherwise formless material of plastic and wood and metal. And that would be the principle of being. Nature makes a thing what it is. Nature is also the principle of doing. For those things which have processes, functions, or activities, or can perform actions, nature is what conditions us to be able to do certain things and conditions us to be able not to do certain things. It also will eventually assign to us what should be done and what should be avoided, which we'll get to in the ensuing slides. So let's look first of all at the essence of a thing. What do we mean by the essence of a thing? So the essence of a thing, or the nature of a particular thing, is a universal, meaning when we talk about a particular thing, we might use the analogy of taxonomy, where we're talking about the categorization of living things in a hierarchical structure, which ultimately drills down to the species. And so we might think of the nature of triangles. We can even do this for geometric items. What is a triangle? A triangle is a three-sided Euclidean plane figure in which the inner angles add up to 180 degrees. Right? All triangles fit that description. That is the nature of a triangle. We might talk about the nature of trees. Trees by nature have roots, a trunk system, and leaves which absorb sunlight and other material elements in order to convert them to other material elements so that they can survive, take in nourishment. This is the nature of trees. This is actually something that every tree has or describes every tree. So it's universal of all trees. We might think of the nature of squirrels to have 4 legs and a tail and gather nuts and do all kinds of things. It's all squirrels do that. It's in the nature of a squirrel to do that. And finally, human nature. We can say that humans are a creature which seeks truth and loves and learns and laughs and does all of these things because it has human nature. So the essence or the nature of a particular thing is something that every member of a species shares. So every human being has human nature. And it's the same human nature. We share this human nature. Individuals like myself, I'm simply a particular instance of Homo sapiens, the species of the human person. I'm a particular instance of what is otherwise a universal human nature. The human nature that I have is the same human nature that my wife has, that my kids have, that my friends have, that my boss has. All individuals within a particular species share the same nature. We're simply a particular instance of that nature, vastly different from those who share the same nature, but we share the same nature nonetheless. And it is this nature which allows us to speak categorically of an entire species. Notice how when we talked about the nature of triangles, all triangles have three sides and inner angles that add up to 180 degrees. All trees have roots and trunks and branches. All squirrels have particular physical descriptions. All humans have particular capacities and functions. When we say these things, we're not speaking of all 7 billion humans or all however many billion or trillion squirrels or even more trees in the world. We're speaking of the nature. It is in the nature of the human person to be this way. So, having discussed the essence of a particular thing, let's talk about the principle of being. So, nature, or the essence of a thing, is what makes a thing what it is. What makes a table a table is the nature of a table being applied to or forming material elements into what we know of as a table. That is what is known classically as the formal cause. If you remember, we discussed the four causes. The formal cause is that kind of blueprint imposition that is put upon material elements to make a thing what it is. So what makes this conglomeration of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and other trace elements into a human being as opposed to a monkey is that the human being has a human nature, whereas the monkey has the nature of a monkey. And so that nature is what makes that conglomeration of elements into a particular thing. Now, individuals, as we said, individuals are particular instances of a species and particular instances of a nature, can more or less perfectly instantiate a nature. What do we mean by this? When I say that a human being has particular descriptions or particular elements to being a human, I'm not speaking of individual humans, I'm speaking of human nature. But as we all know, there are some things that we can say about human nature that maybe can't be said of each and every single of the 7 billion humans on Earth. And we'll see some examples of this in a moment. Now, historically speaking, it's been traditional use of language to say that if a particular being does not perfectly instantiate a nature in existence, that it's a bad version, right? When we use that term, it's crucial that you understand we don't mean morally bad. So let's look at some examples. So let's start with more perfect instances of being. So triangles with exceedingly straight sides and angles adding up perfectly to 100 degrees, 180 degrees. That would be a perfect instance of a triangle. What about trees that have deep, strong roots and sturdy branches and that produce leaves and can do all the things that it's supposed to? That's a perfect instance of a tree. What about squirrels that have 2 eyes and 4 legs, right? That would be a perfect instance of a squirrel. Or humans that have 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 eyes, good hearing, good senses, and can move about. That is a human, that is a perfect instance. That particular individual is a good instance of the nature of humanity. All right? These are all good. They're good versions of their natures. But that doesn't make them morally good. What about less perfect instances? Let's say that I draw a triangle on a piece of fabric. All right, that triangle may not have perfectly straight sides. They may actually be curved, and therefore the angles that are part of that triangle may not add up to 180 degrees. Maybe it adds up to more than 180 degrees. Well, that wouldn't fit that wouldn't fit the criteria to be a perfect instance of a triangle, but nevertheless, it's a triangle. It's just not a very good triangle. The same thing with trees. A tree that doesn't produce very deep, strong roots. They're very shallow, and the branches are very sickly, and it doesn't look like it's going to live very long when the average lifespan of that particular type of tree is decades longer. That would be a bad version, or that would be a bad instantiation of the nature of a tree. What about a squirrel that's born missing an eye, or that was only born with 3 legs, right? That doesn't fit the nature of a squirrel, and would be a bad instance of a squirrel. And the same thing, humans that have no legs, or that are missing arms, that are blind, or that are deaf, or that have some other kind of disability, would be a less than perfect instance of human nature. It would be, for all intents and purposes, a kind of bad version of human nature. But it's crucial here that we understand these are bad versions, but not morally bad versions. They do not instantiate their nature as perfectly as we would expect. Now, moving on to the principle of doing. The nature or the essence of a thing conditions it to be able to do certain things. Nature is what conditions a thing to act or to function or to process in certain ways, right? Nature itself, the essence of a thing, is the directedness of a thing's processes and functions towards its fulfillment or its flourishing, its ultimate good or its ultimate purpose. Basically, all the functions, all the processes, all the ability to act for created things, all of those things are directed towards something. They have a purpose, they have a goal, they have a reason for existing, and it is for the flourishing or the fulfillment of that particular thing. The nature of a squirrel is that it conditions the squirrel to process, function, and act in certain ways that fulfill it as a squirrel. Same thing for a tree. All the functions, processes of a tree are directed by nature towards its flourishing, its fulfillment. And the same thing can be said for the human person. All the various processes, functions, and abilities and potentialities that human persons have are directed towards the fulfillment and flourishing, the ultimate good of the human person. Now, here's where we start to get into something a little closer to morality. To do that which leads to flourishing is good. To do that which frustrates our flourishing is bad. Now, morality applies here, but only for humans. So let's look at what we mean by this. So once again, let's look at some more perfect instances. So trees, via their roots, take up water and through their leaves convert carbon dioxide into oxygen, and in the process of doing that are able to utilize those elements to nourish itself. That is a perfect instance of a tree doing what it's supposed to for it to flourish. What about squirrels that gather nuts and move swiftly? They gather nuts obviously to sustain them, and they move swiftly in order to be able to avoid predators. That's what squirrels should do because that is good for them. That's a perfect instance of their nature, because if they didn't do these things, they would not flourish. Now, what about less perfect instances of these things? What about a tree that fails to uptake water and does not absorb photons so as to be able to nourish itself? We would say that's a bad tree. It's not doing the things that the nature of a tree has designed it to do for it to flourish, and because of that, it's not flourishing. Same thing for squirrels. What if the squirrel, instead of gathering nuts, gathered rocks? Can't eat rocks, so it's not going to nourish itself or any children that it may have, or that it moves slowly in the presence of predators, or even stands completely still in the presence of a predator so as to not avoid it. That would be detrimental to the life of the squirrel. It would be an imperfect, a bad instance of its instantiating a nature because it is not doing what it is by nature supposed to do. Now, this brings us to natural law and morality. So, Good and bad instances of doing only have moral quality for humans. Why? Because of our intellect and our will. Once again, it's crucial for us to understand nature determines what is good for us, not us. Nature has determined what it is for us to flourish. Our processes, our intellect, our will, all of the abilities that we have, all the potentialities that we have, the capacity that we have to do anything is there for us to flourish. Well, what determines what is flourishing and what is good for us? It's our nature. We are by nature directed towards something that is good already. We don't get to decide that, it's determined for us. However, animals do this on instinct. And if they don't do it on instinct, we would simply say they have a defective instinct. Humans don't do this by instinct, we do it by intellect and will. See, by intellect, humans understand not only that we have a nature, but we also understand and discover what that nature has determined is good for us. And then we don't do what is good for us by instinct, we do it by will, meaning the intellect proposes to the will what is good, and then by the will we choose to do what nature has determined is good for us. We don't choose what is good for us, we choose how to do what is good for us. The good is determined by our nature. And so, I have to understand that animals act on instincts and that humans should act upon reason and will. And the key here is that should. See, if we will the frustration of our flourishing, we are morally bad. All right? That would mean we have a problem. All right? If we choose to do that which does not lead to our flourishing, then we are doing something morally bad because we are choosing it. Animals doing something that seemingly is bad for their nature is doing it on instinct and therefore is not morally culpable for it. We are morally culpable for it because of our intellect. Should we know what is good for us? Yes. If we don't know what is good for us, then we are ignorant. And then we can get into discussing why are we ignorant. Is our ignorance our fault or not? And it could be the case for both of them. But maybe we know the good, but we do not do the good we know we should do. Then that means we're not ignorant. We simply have a corrupt or defective will. And we are willing actually what is bad for us or even what we know is bad for us. And then we are definitely morally culpable. So as you can see, natural law is a type of law because it's objective. It's not something we determine. It's determined for us. It's determined by our nature. Our nature has determined for each and every human person what is human flourishing. It's only by our intellect and our will that we are morally culpable for doing what is good, because by our intellect we know what nature has determined as good for us, and by the will we choose to do that.